This is the voice of Oskar Schindler.
Die Verfolgung der jüdischen Menschen im Generalgouvernement im polnischen Raum haben hier in ihren Grausamkeiten eine allmähliche Steigerung genommen. Im Jahre 39 und dann 40 mit den Judensternen und die Einschließung und Zusammenpferchung der Menschen im Ghetto haben natürlich den Sadismus in der Reinkultur erst im Jahre 41 und 42 geoffenbart, und ein denkender Mensch, der mit dem inneren Schweinehund siegreich fertig wurde, musste einfach helfen. Es war keine andere Möglichkeit.
A question, a puzzle, to be answered by students of human behavior and history. How does a member of the Nazi Party, a heavy drinker, lecher, confidence man, come to be buried in the Christian cemetery in Jerusalem, to be held as a hero by the people of Israel, proclaimed by that government as a righteous Gentile, fated as a personal savior to more than 1,000 people? Yet until the publication of the novel Schindler's List by Thomas Keneally and Oscar-winning adaptation of that book by Steven Spielberg, few people outside of Israel had ever heard the name Oskar Schindler. A Thames television documentary made 10 years previous had gone virtually unseen in the United States. A proposed motion picture version of his life had been planned 20 years before, but had fallen through. He was a man who died at the relatively early age of 66. He had lived in obscurity in Argentina, and after that, in a small, barren apartment in Frankfurt, near the Bahnhof station. He never lost the gregariousness and charm that he showed in the pre-war and war years, but something hadn't gone out of him. A spark, a sense of urgency and energy that only reappeared when he was amidst his old friends, the people he had saved from certain death at the hands of the Nazis. Oskar Schindler relished being the center of attention, being the focal point of fun and happiness and smiles. His last years saw him virtually in exile in his homeland, ignored by other Germans on the street. A portly, middle-aged businessman, there was nothing about him that seemed larger than life or heroic. But by simply acting in a civilized manner, by doing what any human being should do for another, by simply treating human beings as human beings, Oskar Schindler showed himself to be as heroic as any man who was ever on a battlefield. The Holocaust and World War II began with World War I, a monument to blood and misguided patriotism. Imperial Germany allied with Austria-Hungary. 4 long years of war produced the sacrifice of millions of men on both sides. French, British, Italian, American, Austrian, Russian, German. In 1918, Germany became a republic for the first time. Frederick Ebert became its first president. But extremists on both the far left and the far right continued to agitate against the republic. Communists and socialists called for the elimination of corrupt remnants of the old regime. A new People's Republic would assure equal work, pay, and food for all. Right-wingers tried to inspire loyalty to the old Germany, led by defeated generals, the post-war Reichswehr, was limited to 100,000 men, a small portion of its former strength. But other ex-soldiers formed the Freikorps, an unofficial army also dedicated to restoring pride to Germany. Political and food riots were frequent. Millions of Germans resented the Treaty of Versailles, imposed by the victorious powers. The treaty dismembered Greater Germany and gave huge portions of land to France and Czechoslovakia. It also called for a gargantuan war debt to be paid from Germany to the victors. The result was economic chaos. The Reichsmark was nearly valueless. A wheelbarrow full of marks could not even buy a single loaf of bread. Various political speakers tried swinging the nation to their side, but none was able to unify a defeated, depressed, and confused people. In Munich, a hotbed of politics and nationalism, an Austrian named Adolf Hitler rose to prominence as the spearhead of National Socialism, a fascistic and self-centered theory of government predicated on several specious ideas, among which was the superiority of Aryan blood and the inferiority of Jews. Anti-Semitism had been a fact of life in Germany, France, Poland, and elsewhere for centuries. Hitler and his uniformed fanatical followers were able to tap into that basic and primal hatred of the outsider. Clearly, it was the Jew that betrayed Germany. Among Hitler's early followers, Ernst Röhm, homosexual sadist, head of the uniformed gang of street thugs known as the SA, and later murdered on express orders from Adolf Hitler. Hermann Goering, aerial hero of the war, now a porcine morphine addict. Julius Streicher, self-proclaimed Jew-hater #1, editor of the newspaper Der Stürmer. Ex-chicken farmer Heinrich Himmler, whose bland appearance hid a ruthless political genius. Himmler would institute the extermination of the so-called inferior race. Dr. Joseph Goebbels, the hawk-faced, club-footed expert at media manipulation, who would sing the praises of physical perfection. And Gregor Strasser, one of Hitler's few friends who actually believed the ideals of National Socialism. Hitler would later have him murdered. The Nazi Party had a small but devoted band of followers. The SA, a gang of street bullies, roamed the streets of Munich and later Berlin, Frankfurt, and Stuttgart, enforcing the informal ideas of the Nazi Party, with uniforms, flags of red, white, and black, and the use of the twisted cross known as the swastika, plus free beer. The Nazi Party began to get a strong following. The Weimar Republic began to recover, gaining goodwill abroad. President Ebert died, succeeded by aging Field Marshal von Hindenburg. His military background hardly made him ideal to head a democracy, but he inspired a sense of stability to the outside world. Foreign money flowed into the German industry, primarily from the US and Britain. The standard of living rose temporarily. Parallel with the frenetic era of post-war Germany was the oddly uneventful early life of Oskar Schindler. Born in the Sudetenland in German-speaking Czechoslovakia, Schindler's father was German, his mother Czech. His father was uncommunicative, distant. His mother was caring and apologetic. The young Schindler seemed to have a childhood immunity to the virulent anti-Semitism that ran rampant in Europe. He played with Jewish, German, and Czech children and saw no difference between them. Belittled and dismissed by his father, the young Schindler compensated by ignoring deeper emotions. Instead, he immersed himself in sports, socializing. Germany of the late 20s suffered the depression that hit the rest of the world. There were soup lines, instant poverty, and national anger. The brown-shirted SA and its Nazi leaders became extraordinarily popular. Its followers thought that only the Nazi Party could eliminate inflation and restore national honor. But national honor was the last thing on the mind of 20-year-old Oskar Schindler. Fast cars, booze, and loose women were far more important. Germany in the late 1920s and early 1930s was one of the centers of cultural and hedonistic activities. Oskar Schindler, with his gift for gab and his ingratiating manner, drifted into sales. His father, who ran a small factory, dismissed his son as a ne'er-do-well. Schindler married a girl from Zwickau, but Emily Schindler's father held back on her promised dowry. He too thought Oskar would never amount to anything. Via Hitler's magnetic public speaking and well-orchestrated public appearances, the Nazi movement reached the hearts and minds of more millions. Mistakenly, the Nazis felt Germany was ripe for a revolution. From a Munich beer hall, Hitler and an ally, General Ludendorff, led an abortive riot. But rather than start a groundswell, Hitler was tossed into prison for a year. The smooth-talking fanatic, Joseph Goebbels, replaced Hitler in public for a year, pouring out reams of propagandistic speeches, letters, and posters. While in Landsberg prison, Hitler wrote the blueprint of his ideal, Mein Kampf, my struggle, the Bible of the Nazi movement. His brand of mysticism, unswerving loyalty to the fatherland and to himself, and hatred of Jews. These were the keys for the end of unemployment, red lines, and depression. Despite the anti-Semitic ravings of Streicher and Der Stürmer, many Germans denied the obvious, that the Nazis were attracting larger public support. His year behind bars had made Hitler into a self-proclaimed martyr. He modestly called himself Der Führer, the leader. Open elections saw Nazis making legitimate gains in the Democratic Republic. The Nazi flag flew by the hundreds, the thousands in the open-air rallies. Red, white, and black with the swastika, the ancient symbol of the sun. More riots, communist agitators against Nazi agent provocateurs. Hitler used this fear of communism to his own ends, giving himself an appointment to the Chancellery. By January 1933, von Hindenburg was out. In a torchlight parade, Hitler's thousands, millions of optimistic followers paid pagan homage to the undisputed master of Germany. The Third Reich had begun. Hitler predicted it would last 1,000 years. But it was scarcely the people's will that he was carrying out. Hitler had struck secret deals with the moneyed and industrial interests of Germany and with the military. They would benefit from National Socialism if they would support his dream of a renewed Germany, annexing land and enslaving lesser people. In return, Hitler offered certain concessions. The military would be preeminent under the SS. The SA, led by Rome, would have to be eliminated after they had done their duty. And their duty was to harass, intimidate, and murder Jews. These goons, mostly homosexual like their leader, Rome, would attack Jews in the street under official sanction. Laws were enacted, a step-by-step methodical process of eliminating Jews from Germany. First, their citizenship and right to own property was eliminated. They were second-class citizens. Laws did not apply to them as the laws applied to Germans. Hitler had written, only the application of brute force, used continuously and ruthlessly, can bring about a decision in favor of the side of support. The German eagle, long a symbol of Teutonic domination, took on a new measure of ominous strength. The Communist Party and others were made illegal. After the Reichstag fire caused by Nazi saboteurs, 4,000 communist activists were hauled into prison. Concentration camps, they were called. The SA brown shirts and the black-clad SS joined in rounding up enemies of the state. Independent police forces like that of Prussia were put under central government control. The barrel-bellied Hermann Goering led the parade of hard-bodied, loyal Aryans. Soon, Rome's SA brown shirts would be eliminated by a cold-blooded murder. The German military machine would not countenance an independent military force. The nation was swept up by a wave of banners, parades, and national pride.
It was a great feeling. You felt you belonged to something great. You felt you belonged to a great nation which now finds its feet again.
Hitler's grand plan for revenge and domination began with a feeling of revitalization. The new government created thousands of jobs with Nazi-sponsored work programs and investments from overseas. These goose-stepping soldiers were a symbol of the new, proud Germany. Factories opened up to create consumer goods and war material. Laborers went to work designing and creating the Autobahn, a futuristic motorway. And through tireless media manipulator Joseph Goebbels, the Third Reich was captured on film. Through the pre-war years and up till 1945, the facts of the war and occupation and the horrors of the war were kept hidden from the German people. Instead, they were shown newsreels of the Teutonic charm of innocent blonde maidens dancing to spring. The pre-war years and even the early successful years of war in Nazi Germany and the occupied territories were a delightful time, if you were German. Like most Germans, Oskar Schindler saw the improvements in industry and society that the Nazi Party had wrought. And like many, he joined the National Socialist Party, although not until 1938. It made sense. He met wealthy and powerful people. As an informer and domestic spy, he could lead a life of apparent ease and luxury while making intelligent reports to his superiors. His cover as a sybaritic playboy was perfect for intelligence gathering. Furthermore, his connections with the Abwehr would serve him well in later years. Schindler never let his marriage status get in the way of temporary female companionship. He always took a teenager's delight in sexual conquest, but his charm never made women feel used. And that self-same charm, partly instinctive, partly practiced after years of salesmanship, let him blend like a chameleon into the ranks of the SS and the Nazis. His hail-fellow, well-met personality gave him the ability to flatter, to tell people what they wanted to hear. This kind of affability, a blindness to the reality of fascism, was what allowed the Nazi movement to gain its iron grip on Germany and Europe. The rights of assembly were taken away. Enemies of the state now included Jews, all non-Germans, gypsies, communists, and other religious groups. The rights of citizens were summarily stripped. Jewish children were banned from German schools, forced to attend makeshift Jewish schools instead. Friendship with Jews made a German suspect. Thousands moved out of the country, lucky to be able to take a suitcase full of their belongings. Berlin spewed out anti-Semitic propaganda in a vile stream. Labor unions and collective bargaining were, of course, eliminated as counterproductive to the functioning of the state.
Ferndienst machen zur Meldung. Achtung! Abteilung 6, 310 mit 13114 beim Grabenbau. Danke. Heilder! Heilder! Lassen Sie weiterarbeiten. Weiterarbeiten!
thousands of other men of God, Protestant, Catholic, Jewish, were persecuted, arrested, confined in concentration camps.
Sagen nur so viel. Wenn ich das Wort Kultur höre, dann greife ich schon nach meinem Revolver.
All culture, except that which was approved by the Reich, was forbidden, branded as traitorous, corrupt. Those who didn't agree were persuaded by the blackjack or the bullet. Deification of Hitler reached into the minds of the smallest children. Citizens of the Reich were complacent. Their bellies were full. As is always the case when a government starts waving the flag, the large industrial powers went on a feeding frenzy. Whatever was good for the country was good for them, as long as they made a profit. Companies such as Krupp, the arms manufacturer, and IG Farben saw their quarterly profits soar. Much of the world outside Germany turned a blind eye to the systematic hatred of the Nazis and the rearming of the nation, despite the flagrant violations of the treaties of Versailles. Adolf Hitler, Austria's native son, was welcomed as a liberating hero. A similar reception was given Nazi troops when they invaded the Sudetenland, Oskar Schindler's home, the German-speaking area of Czechoslovakia. The Nazi war machine turned its sights on an eastern target, Poland. But this was not a German-speaking territory that would welcome Nazis as brothers. This was merely a territory to be conquered, a people to be exploited. In September 1939, the Lightning War, Blitzkrieg, began against Poland. The army and civilians fought back, but they were no match for the mechanized and airborne German military might. A police state was imposed, and the Jewish populations of Warsaw, Krakow, and other cities were herded into ghettos, stripped of their belongings and money. Rather than let this manpower go to waste, Heinrich Himmler's SS devised a method of exploiting Jews and other so-called non-Aryans. In addition to forcing them to live in squalor, the SS sold them as labor to enterprising German industrialists. This is a voice of a survivor of the Polish ghetto.
The Germans had lists of prominent citizens of Warsaw, and denunciation and murder became a daily event. Warsaw, the capital of Poland, had been the commercial center of the country. Most of Poland's Jews were there, and with the completion of the occupation, they were singled out for special treatment. They were pulled out of the food queues, they were insulted, beaten up, and shot in the streets. All Jews were to be confined within the ghetto. Tens of thousands of people left their homes. The Jews made desperate attempts to resettle in the congested area of the ghetto. This movement of people happened at a time when typhoid was raging in the city. On the morning of November the 15th, 1940, the Jews found themselves completely surrounded by high walls. There was no way out anymore. The walls were 10 feet high, with a crown of barbed wire and broken glass. Enormous notices were put up. Typhus area, through traffic only.
With the German occupation and Polish sympathizers, Jews had no recourse, no one to turn to. Despite the Nazi propaganda films showing synagogues in full flower, synagogues were closed all through occupied Nazi territory. Those with identification papers out of order were often arrested or shot on sight. It was a cold, miserable, isolating experience. Jewish residents were forbidden to live outside the ghetto. Many committed suicide. Others begged on the streets. Government work camps offered at least some relief from the ghetto. It kept hands and minds busy during the day and offered blissful exhaustion at night back in the ghetto. In Plotzau, outside of Krakow, Oskar Schindler bought an enamel works and made a deal with the SS for labor from the ghetto. The work was hard and long. Schindler never coddled his enforced employees. But within the factory, there was none of the brutality, none of the abrupt death so common under the SS. Schindler's chameleon face could be an affable Nazi with German officers or a friendly uncle to his Jews. He made great money on the black market, trading goods like alcohol, food, and cigarettes to pay for extra rations for his employees. As a result, the production level at the factory and the attitude of his workers remained comparatively high, despite the presence of Untersturmführer Armin Geth, commander of the Plotzau camp.
I can describe him to you as a wild animal in a large human body.
Sadist, murderer, sexual deviant, Armin Geth represented all that was evil about Nazi Germany. Yet he saw Schindler as a friend and fellow black marketeer. Geth himself made huge amounts of money, trading, selling, and hoarding black market tobacco, alcohol, and food. But unlike Schindler, Geth treated murder casually. He treated human suffering with sheer indifference. The makeshift concentration camps of the 1930s grew into gigantic, open-air human warehouses by the early 1940s. Industry took full advantage of this cheap slave labor, with the SS receiving the bounty on each worker. Sanitation was dismal, disease was rampant, heat was a rarity, clothing was nearly non-existent. Bit by bit, the SS methodically stripped its victims of every shred of humanity. Displaced persons by the trainload were shipped in cattle cars across Europe to these camps. Jews, Gypsies, Poles, Ukrainians, Russians, expendable human fodder to feed the German war horse. Millions were uprooted from their homes. Family jewelry, religious icons, wedding bands, gold teeth, clothes, livestock, machinery, everything was taken away to pay for the Nazi dream of world conquest. As despicable in their own way as the Nazi conquerors were the collaborators. In predominantly Catholic Poland, little sympathy was felt for those forced to live in ghettos or camps. And within the ghetto, collaborators betrayed their own people, working hand in glove with their captors.
They were the German police. There were the Polish blue police. And there were the Jewish police. The German and Polish police carried firearms. The Jewish police force was confined to the ghetto and only allowed to carry truncheons. In this way, the entrances and exits to the ghetto were controlled. If these three authorities could be bought off, a fortune could be made by smuggling food and materials. The Jewish police force, numbering some 2,000 men, behaved with particular inhumanity towards their fellow Jews. These men supervised some of the worst brutalities of the ghetto. Eventually, they were lined up by the Germans, given a brief speech of thanks for their work, and shot in the back by mounted machine guns, commanded by one of the German Death Head battalions. Many of the Germans were afraid to go into the ghetto because of the dangers of typhus and tuberculosis. Day by day, the government of the ghetto was carried out by a body of Jewish elders called the Judenrats. This committee of Jews was the executive organ of the German occupying force in the ghetto. This council was obliged to carry out all orders of the Germans, and on one occasion was asked to supply Jewish girls for a German brothel to be set up for the conquerors. But the stench was dreadful, and people tried to avoid touching each other, afraid of catching typhus and lice.
Nazi cameramen detailed life in the ghetto for two important reasons. First is propaganda. These films would show Germans how filthy the Jews of the ghetto were, as if they chose to live in squalor and poverty. And secondly, it would be an eternal document of the last of the Jews in Europe. The grand plan of the Nazis was to eliminate the Jew from the continent entirely. At first it was planned that they would simply be expelled or deported, or left to die on their own. Later came the final solution, one of the most awful and insidious secrets of the war. Frequent raids by German police on the ghetto, called actions, resulted in instant execution. Schindler, with his connections in the Abwehr and SS, often passed word along when an action was contemplated. It was selfish in a way. Schindler didn't want to lose his workers. But each time he did this, he put himself at risk of death. And he would show his humanity in other simple ways to those who worked in his factory.
He knew everybody by name. And he would do things, personal things. He would leave some extra bread for me, or order an extra bowl of soup, things like that. You know, just a little skinny little boy who stood on a box so I could reach the lathe and and work.
When I came to Schindler, I regained my strength, I regained my body, you know. And when you're not hungry, your mind is completely different. But he gave me what the Nazis took away from me. He gave me hope.
The desolation of the Jews in the ghettos and in the camps was a secret that was kept from modern, contemporary Germany. Germans were kept in ignorance of the harsh realities of the camps and the ghettos. If they asked, they were told not to ask, and they went about their business. But those whose work meant dealing with those realities were faced with the decision of conscience. It was wrong and inhumane. Did they act or did they turn away? Oskar Schindler chose to act. One of that rare breed, a good German in World War II, Schindler deviously arranged to construct what amounted to be his personal concentration camp, which he dubbed Emalia. It was a slave labor camp, there's no doubt about that, but within those confines, it was a miracle. There were blankets at night, food, and interference from the SS was rare. After all, Schindler was producing material for the war effort, and that was important. Prisoners from other camps sought desperately to get transferred to the comparatively safe haven of Amalia. All the while, Schindler amassed a small fortune in legal profits, as well as his illegal fortune on the black market. Some of his profits were used to bribe SS officers and government officials, but just as often, he would secretly supply a bottle of wine to one of the Amalia rabbis for use in Sabbath ceremonies. Oskar Schindler saw his Jews as individuals, remembering their names as any good salesman would. He could not look at them as anonymous figures aboard a cattle car. In this way, Schindler was swimming upstream. The constant barrage of anti-Semitic propaganda in newspapers, radio, and even in feature films was continuous and ubiquitous. Jews and Poles were invariably cast as subhuman types in German-made melodramas in the 1940s. This astounding racist pseudo-documentary purports to show the scientific differences between the Jew and the normal human being.
Natürlich wissen sich diese Ghetto-Juden zunächst noch nicht richtig in den sauberen europäischen Anzügen zu bewegen. Etwas besser können es diese Berliner Juden. Ihre Väter und Großväter haben zwar auch noch im Ghetto gelebt, aber davon merkt man nun äußerlich nichts.
If the German people could be convinced by continuous propaganda that the Jews were something less than human, their elimination would be nothing more than exterminating a form of vermin.
Das häusliche Zusammenleben der Juden zeigt einen auffallenden Mangel an selbstschöpferischer Zivilisationsfähigkeit. Auf Deutsch gesagt, die jüdischen Behausungen sind unsauber und verwahrlost.
Schindler learned that he had become a cult hero in the Zionist underground. From Zionist agents, he learned that camps like Auschwitz, Dachau, Buchenwald, and Treblinka were no longer just prisons. They had become Vernichtungslager, death camps. No longer were the Nazis patient enough to wait for disease, starvation, or attrition to take their toll. Now modern expedients came into the picture, and all of Schindler's Jews were at risk. It was the logical end to a systematic elimination of the Jew from German society. First, stripping the Jewish population of their rights, herding them into a ghetto, and finally, the destruction of the ghetto itself. Then herded off to camps, separated from their children and families. Under the watchful eye of the loyal army and SS, the final solution had been put into effect. The systematic destruction of the Jewish race by Zyklon B through airtight pipes in buildings euphemistically called bath and disinfection. Women would line up innocently for their shower. German soldiers cynically assured the new arrivals at the death camps that their stay would only be temporary. Some guards even took money as payment for the inmates' trip home. Those useless to the Third Reich were the first to go. The elderly, the sick, and the women and children. It was cold, ruthless, and calculated, as reflected in this letter by the SS regarding the crematoria.
For putting the bodies into the furnace, we suggest simply a metal fork moving on cylinders. Each furnace will have an oven measuring only 24 by 18 inches, as coffins will not be used. For transporting the corpses from the storage points to the furnaces, we suggest using light carts on wheels, and we enclose diagrams of these drawn to scale. Heil Hitler.
Many froze to death during the winters. Many died from tuberculosis and typhus. Thousands were used as human guinea pigs in bizarre experiments, testing how many atmospheres of pressure a human body could withstand before it imploded, or how long a healthy child could survive being injected with live bacteria or poisons. Some of the medical research proved legitimate and useful. Other experiments went beyond the merely sadistic into the category of the unspeakable. Through it all were the showers and the ovens, the smokestacks that belched, the fine white ash of human remains, spontaneous executions. Death had 1,000 different names. Through his intelligence contacts with the Abwehr on the one hand, and the Zionist underground on the other, Schindler knew that his camp at Amalia would not stand for long. He had been there for 4 years and amassed a fortune in diamonds, currency, and negotiable consumer goods. He had also saved hundreds, perhaps thousands of lives from starvation or death in the other camps. But he also had come under the eye of the SS, which suspected him of war profiteering. He hatched a daring and ingenious scheme. Since the Armaments Directorate thought that Schindler's factory was essential for the war effort, they wanted it moved to safer ground, further from the front. Schindler found an empty factory in Brinwitz, near his home in Czechoslovakia. With the help of his associates, he formed a list of 1,100 people whom he deemed absolutely essential for the operation of his factory, which was, of course, essential to the war effort. He would get his Jews out alive and relocate them to safe ground. The list defined the people in Schindler's company as experts in metallurgy, ceramics, glassware, and machine tooling. They were nothing of the kind. But enough gold crossed the hands of the SS that the 1,100 were allowed out. But Schindler's operation was starting to attract official attention. Rumors about Amon Goeth's criminal activities had reached the SS and the Gestapo, and since Goeth knew Schindler, Schindler himself was suspect. On top of that, Schindler was arrested twice. Some investigators thought he was getting far too cozy with his Jews. The boxcars kept moving toward the death camps. They were factories of destruction. Up to 6,000 people a day could... But even with gas chambers and machine gun bullets, Jews could not be killed fast enough for the Nazis. Time was running out. More death camps, more trains, ovens working day and night, belching their ash into the air. Time was running out for Oskar Schindler, too. The enamel works of Platzau was ordered closed down. He would repopulate a factory with new workers. The workers from Platzau would be sent to the death camps. With fast talking and an expenditure of thousands of marks, he talked the SS out of that plan. Thanks to Adolf Hitler's insistence on running his own war against the advice of his generals, the tide of the war had changed. The ill-advised attack on Russia had stalled and ultimately resulted in the defeat of the German army. The Russian army pushed back across its own land and into Nazi-held territory. In the desert, the Afrika Korps was stalled and defeated by Generals Montgomery and Patton. And at sea, German U-boats and battleships were being destroyed by Allied planes and torpedoes. Disgruntled elements of the German High Command, plus priests and civilians, decided it was time to end the war. A trusted young staff officer with access to Der Fuhrer planted a suitcase bomb beside Hitler in this countryside headquarters. Miraculously, Hitler survived, the force of the blast being deflected by the heavy oaken table. The conspirators were tried and hanged, but the future was clear. The war would be lost. The German army was tired, overextended, out of supplies. Russian troops pushed the Eastern Front back. Retreating, the Germans tried to eliminate every trace of the death camps, like Treblinka. There were no witnesses. Now, there would be no evidence. Hitler was determined never to give up. He would see Germany die in flames with him. Back at the Platzau work camp, Armand Goeth sat with Oskar Schindler in a drunken, mad game of cards, played for the lives of the Jewish women working as maids for the commander. The game bounced back and forth between the two men, apparently a lark for Schindler. In the end, he won.
Who comes but Oskar Schindler? And he didn't even walk into the villa. He opened the door and he said to me, "Now you're coming with me. I have a list." And I didn't know what he was talking about. I didn't know about the list.
Still playing the role of the loyal Nazi, Oskar Schindler arranged for his 700 men to be shipped by train to Brindlitz. The 300 women and children would have to wait, but the camp was closing. There was no place for them to wait, so they were temporarily shipped to Auschwitz. They knew what that could mean to them. Armand Goeth was arrested for blackmail and black marketeering. Ultimately, he would be hanged unrepentant for his crimes. After a long, anxious, roundabout trip, the 700 men on Schindler's list arrived by freight car at the distant location of Brindlitz, met by Oskar Schindler, even though the factory itself was nowhere near operational. In fact, during the few months of its operation, the factory never produced anything very useful to the Third Reich. But the 300 women and children on Schindler's list were still in mortal danger. The
10 minutes, so we knew that we are in the wrong place.
The stench and sight of death were all around them. The women were led into the bath chambers. They'd heard the stories. They were going to be gassed, but instead it was a real shower. They waited in the death camps to be delivered by Oskar Schindler. But Schindler himself had been arrested by the Gestapo. In the investigation of Armand Goeth, Schindler's name had come up. The SS wanted to know Schindler's connection to it. They held him for several days. Finally, he was released and realized his women were in Auschwitz.
We got news that Schindler is in Auschwitz. He took us out. He saved us from the gas chamber, the last moments.
Once away from the danger of Auschwitz and to the comparative safety of Brindlitz, Schindler's Jews proved to be less than helpful to the Third Reich, and Schindler apparently approved. The armaments manufactured at Brindlitz were useless for the war effort.
I was supposed to put powder in big shells for they to send to the war. I used to never put in the powder in the shell. Schindler, he smelled it out that something is wrong, but he would never do nothing.
The Nazi monster was caught in the pincers of the Allies' fresh and powerful armies. The Russians from the east thirsting for revenge, the British and Americans from Normandy, and the Americans again up from Sicily. Hitler, Berlin, and the Nazi dream fell. Amid the collective sigh of victory and relief, the free world learned of the unspeakable horrors of the death camps. Schindler and his workers knew that the Russians approaching from the east would show no mercy to any Germans. Schindler's Jews now protected him. In the garb of a concentration camp inmate, Oskar fled to the west in the company of several ex-employees. The small fortune he had accumulated over the war years was gone. Again, with the help of former inmates, he tried to establish himself as a rancher in Argentina, but he was not suited for a life of stability. Like a nova, he had expended his energy in saving others. He had none left for himself. In the late 50s, he left his wife, Emily, and moved back to Germany, where he lived in near poverty and obscurity. But visiting Israel, he realized that he was a hero there, and he always recognized his old friends.
We went to the airport to meet him, and I started to introduce myself. And he said, I know who you are. You're Little Lace. I didn't have to tell him who I was.
Near obscurity in his homeland, fame and thanks in a nation of Jews. He was given the rare honor of planting a carob tree in the Avenue of the Righteous in Jerusalem. There is no doubt that he enjoyed being adored and feted during his days in Israel. Yet back in Germany, he lived alone, forgotten, in a small apartment near the Frankfurt Bahnhof. Oskar Schindler died in October 1974. At his request, he was buried in Jerusalem.